Hello and welcome to The Mohit Show. In this video, I'll be covering posts from r/detrans, a well-moderated subreddit for people questioning, desisting, or detransitioning. On to this video's first post, titled, "The US Transgender Survey is solely about transgender people and retransitioners while disqualifying actual regret, that's indifference." And this is by u/detransis, which is a mod of this subreddit. This was inspired by this thread, just a link to the survey and asking if anyone did it. Namely, after looking into it myself and seeing that the newest version of the USTS specifically asks questions that disqualify detransitioners from answering it, particularly those who already have detransitioned and no longer are trying to be trans. When you open the page to be notified when the USTS 2022 survey goes live, you'll see a form and specifically look at these questions, which include, I'm committed to, taking the USTS when it's available, I'm trans or non-binary myself, or share the USTS with trans people in my life, second first name, third last name. Fourth thing is what's your current age, and fifth thing is what US state or territory do you currently live in. Literally right there, clear as day. Taking the USTS when it is available. I am trans or non-binary myself. This is a very small demographic of detransitioners, and by technical standards, most of which wouldn't count as detransitioners, as they'd be mostly trans. But I decided to look into this further. Never mind. I did an analysis and deep tear apart of Turban's analysis and usage of the 2015 USTS to discredit detransitioners and particularly our subreddit. I read that analysis next. For anyone who doubts this, I took an archive of the page so you can see it for yourself. I will state this isn't a problem. I think trans people should have data solely catered to them and their needs and what's going on with them. Where I take a problem is when this survey is used to represent detransition, an understudied and misunderstood phenomenon that is now on the rise thanks to the dangers of the affirmative care method, as well as distortion of gender identity and diagnosis criteria. I'll put that link in the description. I decided to look deep into this because if there's anything I stand for, it's accurate and current data. When I learned that the 2022 USTS was discluding detransitioners intentionally, it didn't sit right with me because these are the same people claiming to be researching better care and practices for gender dysphoric people and even weaponizing that data against anyone who's raising concerns. This led to an hour-long search until I stumbled onto a section of the USTS 2015 itself that everyone overlooks. The questions the participants took. That link is also in the description. Immediately, I took notice with the introduction presented to those who took the survey. Please read and respond carefully to the following questions. This is a survey for people who are transgender, trans, or non-binary. It doesn't matter if you have transitioned gender or if you plan to. To see if this survey is for you, please answer the following questions. Right off the bat, it's a bit sketch, but a detransitioner could get into this survey, right? That's what it appears at first. Once you get to the actual questions, please read and respond. Okay. 1. Do you think of yourself as transgender? Must answer to continue, no or yes. Do you identify as more than one gender or as no gender, such as genderqueer or non-binary? Must answer to continue, no or yes. Do you currently live full-time in a gender that's different from the one assigned to you at birth? Must answer to continue. No, skip to 1.14, or yes. Never mind, I hate the stolen language. I took a note of the skip to 1.14, and this is where it started to prove my concerns correctly. 1.14. Someday, do you want to live full time in a gender that's different from the one assigned at birth? Must be answered if you answered no to 1.12. Wait a minute, this just sounds like a questioning question? A detransitioner obviously did live as another gender for an extended period of time, but came to decide it wasn't the case. Well, it says no should skip to 1.16. Let's see this. 1.16. Have you seriously thought about living in a gender that is different than the one assigned to you at birth? Transitioning gender. Respondents who selected no in response 1 to 1.13 must answer to continue. No or yes. 1.17. Do you consider yourself to be a crossdresser? Must answer to continue. No or yes. 1.18. Do you live part of the time in one gender and part of the time in another gender? Must answer to continue. No or yes. Respondents who answered no to 1.10, 1.11, 1.12, 1.14, 1.16, 1.17, and 1.18 were sent to disqualification page number 1. These questions were what made my pupils shrink, honestly. They are directed towards people currently questioning the transition and are leaning on the idea. Technically speaking, a detransitioner could slip by with 1.17 onto the rest of the survey, but let's use myself for instance. I wear men's clothing sometimes just because it's baggy and more comfortable sometimes, but that doesn't make me a crossdresser. They're just clothes. Back to the point, though. If you answered no to 10, 11, 12, 14, 16, 17, and 18, you got disqualified, which means the average detransitioner who feels indifference or regret would not even be given a chance to take the survey. 2. Respondents who were sent to disqualification page number 1 received the following response message. Thank you for your survey responses. We're interested to learn about your identity and experiences. If you would like to tell us more, please respond to the following questions. Please do not provide any information that could be used to identify you, such as your name or contact information. Tell us about your gender identity or expression, text box. Tell us about your experiences related to gender identity or expression, text box. Yet, they most likely discarded anything that might have reported detransition. There's no way to know because this data isn't public or included in their form. My search didn't stop here though. Honestly, I had to be wrong about this, right? Surely this survey did genuinely catch some detransitioners who weren't questioning detransition and not just retransitioners, right? So I looked into the detransition questions. Why did you detransition? In other words, why did you go back to living as your sex assigned at birth? Mark all that apply. Pressure from spouse or partner, pressure from a parent, pressure from other family members, pressure from friends, pressure from my employer, pressure from a religious counselor, pressure from a mental health professional. I had trouble getting a job. I realized that gender transition was not for me. I faced too much harassment/discrimination. It was just too hard for me, or not listed above. This is where I remember just being disgusted. They were looking for select data. Even in the survey I hosted here and the one hosted on Tumblr back in 2016, it included external reasoning as a part of the criteria for why, but here, there isn't a single internal reason like regret, discomfort, or coming to a different conclusion. Which actually there is. But in the list of answers, sure, there's a not listed above until specify, but it seems like they mostly discredited and discarded those kind of responses. And they still got a few of those, so it likely came from people who presently were questioning their transition but still presented as trans. In conclusion, the USTS is purely a survey for transgender and retransitioners alone, which it doesn't do a great job on retransitioners because a repressor isn't going to take a survey aimed towards transgender people. So that's one of their demographics that's being neglected too. What this does tell us is that the USTS cannot be used to account for transition indifference and regret. It can only be used to factor a few who fell in due to currently being transitioned as well as retransition. Never mind the definition of detransition provided by the survey itself. Detransitioning. Respondents were asked whether they had ever detransitioned, which was defined as having gone back to living as their sex assigned at birth, at least for a while, which are extremely loose criteria that could include trying to get a partner pregnant, trying to get pregnant, visiting extended and unsupported family along for other reasons. This definition of detransition is also transphobic in and of itself because in Turban's view, it counted non-binary people. So, it's worth noting whenever someone tries to use the USTS to shut down concerns and claims about detransition, that you should point out that they clearly didn't read the full analysis themselves because they'd have seen that the questions were heavily weighted in one direction and it disqualified anyone who would have detransitioned from even taking it. I don't think the USTS is bad. I think it does a great job portraying and showing other data. Though obviously there is an agenda shown here, even if you go down their other stats and the heavy weights placed on certain responses. But the USTS 2015 and 2020 cannot be used to account or track detransition rates and data. The way they should word their findings in the survey was 8% of respondents reported having stopped HRT or presenting socially as their preferred genders at some point, which is more truthful than the twisted information they choose to use. Anyways, discuss. Enjoy the analysis too. I would like to actually add a little bit of my own analysis right here. So, first, this moderator goes over the actual qualifying questions in the survey. And they are correct about the statements that the questions in order to take the survey actually disqualify anyone who actually regrets their transition or people who detransition for many other reasons as outlined by this person. So that actually stops this survey from even counting basically the important statistic that many people use it for to try to silence any discussion about this topic. Now, later, this poster goes into a later part in the survey where they actually claim to ask about detransition. Now, since most detransitioners would be disqualified, they would not even get to this part. However, this poster goes over how they don't include most of the reasons for this detransition. Now, the counterpoint, I would say that the question I realized that gender transition was not for me would include things like regret. So that does, in fact, account for those things. But I do also have to account that most of these reasons are pretty focused on detransition being something that's only something caused against your will and not something you actively choose for yourself. And it doesn't ask questions about other important reasons, like if you're detransitioning for health reasons, or if you're detransitioning because you got into this mindset that wasn't actually who you really were. Like, those things aren't covered too well by the survey for the people that even get through. And those people would have to be detransitioners that actively cross-dress, which would have to be a very small pool going through here. Anyways, on to the comments. From the comments, a detrans person comments, "Who is Turban? This questionnaire is obviously meant for transgender and non-binary people and excludes those who have permanently detransitioned. So it is not in any shape or form an informative on any subject matters pertaining to detransition. If someone's using it to make statements about detransition, they're a statistically illiterate fool. The same way if someone was using a survey on the parents of school-aged children to determine data on child-free people. It doesn't make sense. I don't understand why this is a problem with the survey, rather than with the idiot making shit up about it. And the original poster comments, Dr. Jack Turban is a gender specialist who has been shown to be paid off by makers of Lupron, used to treat prostate cancer, breast cancer, endometriosis, uterine fibroids, and early puberty, to perform chemical castration of violent sex offenders, or as a part of transgender hormone therapy. He provides affirmative care for those in need, and has been a hardcore trans activist for years, going after Abigail Schreier, don't get me wrong, not the biggest fan of her, for writing the Irreversible Damage book. He's also blocked and harassed numerous public detransitioners. The thing is, the questionnaire, if you look at the review and particularly the detransition section, also portrayed itself as being the answer for this question. But it's sure convenient that they leave out that the USTS actively discluded detransitioners. And the desisted male comments, it's sad how research seemingly doesn't want to touch the subject of detransition. People seem more concerned with their agendas than actually wanting to give people the best care they can provide. A detrans female comments, thank you for this clear analysis. I remember when you covered the previous one and it was a giant eye roll. As you put it, they use this survey to say that the percentage of detransitioners is extremely low. Well, it sure looks that way when you break your back trying to exclude them from one of, if the only, resources used for such a claim. Are there any upcoming detransition focused surveys? Litman's wasn't that long ago, but it might still be beneficial. And the original poster comments, unfortunately, none that I know of. Litman apparently has another analysis coming up soon that was taken in 2020, I want to say. That analysis was better screened and improved from her last piece, which had significant flaws with gaining data. Sadly, the re-detrans one going on in Canada is completely agenda-driven, and they've proven that by silencing and blocking accounts of detransitioners who they deemed as the wrong kind of detrans. Not to mention them platforming a non-binary person who claims to be detrans, but actually is just non-binary transgender. Now on to the next post, titled, Why the USTS survey and Jack Turban's study doesn't really tell us about detransition. And this is also by the moderator u/detransis. This is going to be another copy for my blog, which will be linked in the description. So for everyone reading, I'm sure, especially in the argument of detransition, you've come across this study from a certain infamous Jack Turban, also linked in the description. So we're going to begin dissecting the data provided in this analysis and why it honestly has nothing to do with detransition and provides no suitable evidence. We'll start with what the study claims at the very start, and this is a classic tactic of transgender activists who use a serious topic and then gradually replace it with the topic they are discussing. This study is no different. Purpose. There is a paucity of data regarding transgender and gender diverse TGD people who detransition or go back to living as their sex assigned at birth. This study examined reasons for past detransition among TGD people in the United States. Right here, you can see what I initially was talking about. People who detransition, and not just that, but in scare quotes no less. Go back to living as their sex assigned at birth. Now I rant about this a lot, but for the sake of this particular post, I will humor this language. So, in their world, sex assigned at birth simply means whatever the doctor observed at your birth. They consider it to be assigned because they feel the observation doesn't match their gender identity. Now in the paywalled version of this study, you can't view the next part I'm about to share, which is why this becomes an increasing joke. Some TGD people will detransition, a process through which a person discontinues some or all aspects of gender affirmation. Of note, as with the term transition, the term detransition has become less. This is where it starts to reveal its true colors. With the introduction, which most people will skip over, you can see this definition which doesn't line up, and we'll be visiting another source for a moment. A process through which a person discontinues some or all aspects of gender affirmation. So this implies to Turban, at least, that simply stopping hormones is a detransition. Now let's look at this trans-inclusive article on menopause, also linked in the description. As transgender women age, some choose to lower estrogen dose or possibly stop HRT completely. This can trigger reactions similar to menopause symptoms, but can be mitigated if they're still producing endogenous testosterone via their organs present at birth. The return of testosterone to the body is not often desired. Thus, many folks elect to continue estrogen for much longer than the age of natural menopause, Monge said, adding there's a concern that the longer women are on estrogen, the greater their risk of possible side effects because of other health conditions that may develop with aging. However, let's do a step further. Many transgender people stop HRT treatment in order to get pregnant or to impregnate a partner. By Turban's argument, they temporarily detransition because they've stopped a part in their gender affirmative care. Yet another official page about transgender people quitting HRT for fertility and trying to restore gamete production. Linked in the description. If you have a partner with a uterus who wishes to carry a pregnancy, you may attempt to conceive a baby the old-fashioned way. It is going to be nearly impossible to do this while on hormones, so you will likely have to stop taking them for a time in order to produce enough swimmers to help achieve a pregnancy. Since you likely want to minimize the length of time you spend off your hormone regimen, it's a good idea for your partner to go to the doctor and get a fertility checkup. This will make sure that all the systems on their end are good to go. A doctor can look for anything that might interfere with conception, like blocked tubes, fibroids, etc. The good news about a fertility checkup is that it's usually covered under preventative care, which means insurance will foot the bill. Here on this official inclusive page, it says right there, it's going to be nearly impossible to do this while on hormones. You will likely have to stop taking it for a time, meaning that in order for a trans woman to produce viable sperm for a pregnancy, they need to stop taking HRT long enough to produce healthy sperm again, which again, under Turban's definition, will count them as a detransitioner and then later a retransitioner. Honestly, this study has already contradicted itself and shown none of its data is trustworthy, but I'm going to dive deeper. Study population. The 2015 USTS conducted by the National Center for Transgender Equality is the largest survey of TGD people to date, with 27,715 respondents. A cross-sectional non-probability design was used, in collaboration with more than 400 community outreach organizations. TGD adults greater than or equal to 18 years of age were recruited to complete the survey online. All participants provided information consent before study participation. The final sample included respondents from all 50 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, U.S. territories abroad, and U.S. military bases. Respondents were asked the following question. Have you ever detransitioned? In other words, have you ever gone back to living as your sex assigned at birth, at least for a while? With the following response options. Yes, no, and I have never transitioned. In total, 10,508 respondents reported that they had never undergone gender affirmation transition and were excluded from the analysis. 56 respondents did not answer this question and were also excluded, leaving a sample of 17,151, of whom 22,242, 13%, responded yes, which was coded as a history of detransition. So according to Turban, he claims 2,242 people answered yes to having detransition under the criteria of have you ever gone back to living as your sex assigned at birth, at least for a while, which can mean a lot of things, especially given how these answers actually responded. Let's also not forget that this survey was only distributed within pro-transgender communities, and clinics, meaning that those who reported in another survey that they didn't follow up with their doctor and sought another medical provider would not have been made aware of the survey that Turban is claiming counted detransitioners. So we're going straight to the source at this point, the USTS itself. So this is pretty long. I'm not going to read it, but you can pause and read this if you want. And if you're watching this on TV and it covers the bottom part, I'll scroll. Now, although the definition is vague, it isn't nearly as vague as the one provided by Dr. Turban. Also, with the fact that these are external pressures and not the individual themselves seeking to detransition, it's safe to say they had plans to re-identify as trans at a later time and most likely continue to identify as trans within social media. Hence why they took this survey to begin with. It isn't exactly clear what they mean by returning to living as a gender thought to be at birth. Same thing here, you can read it. I'll just read this part right here. 5%, only 5% of those who had detransitioned reported that they had done so because they realized gender transition was not for them. So generally speaking, 5% of the sample were actual detransitioners, whereas the rest had most likely planned to retransition at a later date and more than likely continue to identify as trans online or stay socially transitioned to some degree. The survey does not go into detail on the matter, so it's hard to say really. Just stress what the reliable detransition related surveys are saying, that there's a severe lack of data and understanding of what detransition is. So we're going to get back to Turban's study now. I was caring for my 80-plus-year-old mother who had severe dementia, and it was just too confusing for her. I don't pass even after FFS, facial feminization surgery, etc. Unable to afford the HRT, lack of trans community at the time. Back in 1997, no one had ever heard, blah, blah, blah. Social services and legal pressure, forced by going to federal prison, family court order, part of custody, and only 2 here are from actual medical reasons. Here, some are about transphobia, and most of this are just temporary little things, and not the situation of detransition that is actually relevant to this subreddit. Maybe only 3 of these reasons provided led to a permanent detransition due to a lack of support. Certainly ones, especially with temporary, like I flip-flop genders because of employment, and there are times when my current job requires me to present as female. The red ones are ones that plan to retransition from the start. They knew this was temporary and had no plan to stick with it. The blue ones are likely the only cases of actual detransition recorded in the survey due to lack of support. The green ones stopped due to health concerns, but most likely switched to non-binary or one of your advocates who just stopped HRT and still identifies transgender. The point is, most of these reasons provided are very obvious, not leading to actual detransition. Maybe mental health professional told I am not transgender and thought I was just crazy could be counted too, but it seems they still had this idea they were trans. The rest of these were clearly planning to retransition from the start. That said, there's more, so let's dissect these ones too. So there's more here. So of these, I obviously left out 3 that they didn't know how to judge. They're unclear. However, of the red, worst cases here are I enjoy having the ability to go back and forth, and my gender feels complicated and changing all the time. Not to mention living in a rural area and not getting hormones, boy modding or girl modding to deal with the loss temporarily? Come on, is this real? These are not definitions of detransition. And I'm now convinced most of the people who answered yes just saw stopping HRT and dressing differently as detransition, which means this data is extremely flawed. Turban quite literally cited people who just identified as non-binary gender, or people who just would, as the trans community call it, boy mode/girl mode to avoid issues with their in-laws. None of this is returning to their assigned gender at birth. None of it. This is so beyond offensive, it isn't funny, especially that people think this is actual data. I will give Turban and the USTS something though. They did provide us very important data on retransitioners. However, none of this data is valuable for detransitioner data. They caught a few actual detransitioners who did detransition due to a lack of support or other reasoning, and it's unfortunate, but this survey particularly was focused on transgender people, and most anecdotal detransition reports have stressed that we no longer see our gender provider and switch to another doctor or just go cold turkey and manage these things ourselves. I could pile screenshot after screenshot, video after video of numerous detransitioners, including myself, saying that we stopped visiting our trans healthcare providers and went on our own, or just found someone else. If you want a more accurate idea of detransition, which will naturally have its own flaws due to DIY treatment along other things, you're better off looking at lots of follow-up in all the surveys that were actually long-term. In conclusion, Turban's study is hardly that. He's just trying to make an agenda and argue numerous cases as detransition when they clearly weren't. If they had plans to retransition from the start, they definitely didn't detransition or go back to their biological sex. Especially the same with those saying their gender identity is more complex, or they like switching between genders. His study and the USTS at that only really proves that retransitioners exist and they have unique issues that should be addressed. However, most detransitioners absolutely do not return to their gender, and even 2 minutes of looking on this subreddit or YouTube will show you that. Which means this survey primarily targeted people who plan to retransition due to support or survival reasons that led them to stopping affirmative treatment, as well as transgender and non-binary people. It caught a very small percentile of detransitioners who found out transition wasn't for them. But these were the few who were supported or didn't feel shame in admitting that transition didn't work. All in all, this study is a load of crap. And from the comments, a detrans male person comments, "Don't worry, trans activists, pathetic losers who are no different from religious activists of the past millennia, will make sure everyone knows that it is science and irrefutable when they spread it all over the internet and social media." Yeah, so before we end, I'd actually like to add a little bit of commenting of myself on this overall. So the important things in this discussion, and most importantly, actually the data mentioned in this article, in these two posts, are that the actual studies around transition are not catching detransitioners, and on top of that, they are manipulating the data in order to actually frame detransition as not a problem. From the start, these surveys are given to people through their doctors, and most detransitioners talked about often, on this subreddit at least, don't stay with the same doctor, so they wouldn't get this in the first place. Now, maybe this survey has been, shared on social media or something, but that's another thing that's often, left by people who detransition. So this survey and many other surveys on this topic are not actually, first of all, getting the detransitioners. After that, these surveys, in their even statements, disqualify people who legitimately detransition permanently due to regret from even being in the survey. And the people they count as detransition oftentimes are just detransitioning temporarily and are just doing it as part of their transition journey as simply a step where they aren't doing the full transition thing. And because of that, whatever detransition numbers get through into the survey are blotted out by people who retransition. And this ends up hiding the data about people who regret transition, hiding the data about people who are medically harmed, people who were led astray into this, people who were manipulated into this. That type of data is not actually being tracked. Yet people are using this to justify the science, proving that no one or hardly anyone detransitions, and even those who detransition do it temporarily or do it mainly out of pressure from evil transphobic people. When that isn't actually the case for what's actually happening in the real world. People really need to be careful of science actually being, let's see, let me get both my fingers in here. Science actually being a manipulation of statistics used to push an agenda. Be careful and always analyze your data. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you'd like more of this content. And have a good day. Thank you.